and welcome back to another Captain's Academy episode with your instructor Chase. Today's episode is going to cover Captain's skills again, because with patch 5.3, old skills have been changed, new skills have been added, and everything that I had sort of talked about before has kind of changed a little bit. So what I'm going to be doing in this episode is I'm going to go over all the skills again, talk about the changes that have happened to some of the skills, as well as what ships I would recommend those skills for. So how I'm going to do this episode is I'm going to go row by row, cover each individual skill, and then talk about which ships could benefit from that particular skill. So let's get going. The very first skill in the first row is Expert Loader. Now, Expert Loader as a skill allows you that, let's say you have a salvo fully loaded. If you want to change the shell type, it'll give you a 50% reduction to the reload time. Not a very useful skill at all, because in most cases it's just fine to fire the salvo you already got and then just load up the new shell in the next reload. So it's not really that useful, so as a skill I would just say pass on this one. The next skill, Basic Firing Training, has changed since pre 5.1. It's now going to only give a 10% reduction in reload time to main battery guns up to 139 millimeters. So that means destroyers will still use a skill, but anything beyond that, like light cruisers and stuff, won't use a skill anymore. So the ships I think that will benefit from this, I would say Russian destroyers could benefit from this. I would say that US destroyers could benefit from this. Even, I guess, Japanese destroyers at the higher tiers where their guns are somewhat viable could benefit from this. And of course, if you were in a Nagato and a Magi and Izuma or Yamato and you're building a secondary build, this could also work. Or actually any ship that could really use its secondary guns, this could be useful. But still, on the initial 15 points that you got, I would actually skip Basic Firing Training because there is a more important skill to get. The next skill is Basics of Survivability. It just accelerates how quickly you can repair from fire or flooding. Again, it could be a useful skill after your initial 15 points. So for maybe battleships on your 16th point, you can offer something like this. But other than that, on the first 15 skills, I would also pass on this as well. And that's because there is this skill, which is Situation Awareness. Situation Awareness is an incredibly important skill to have for all ships in World of Warships, because it allows you to, the minute that you get spotted by something, to have a little exclamation point pop up telling you you've been spotted. But you might say, well, what's the point of having this if I'm in a battleship? Well, let's say you're in a battleship and it's, nothing's really around you, and all of a sudden you see that little exclamation point. You look around, there's nothing that you can see, which immediately suggests that there might be something that's stealthed up around you, and that advanced warning is going to give you a chance to not get surprised when that ship actually does pop up. A very, very useful skill, just because it allows you to figure out where things might be and what might be spotting you. So first row skills, I would say definitely in the first 15 get Situation Awareness. Expert Rear Gunner, again, if you're playing a carrier and you've gotten your 15 points, on your 16th point you can opt for Expert Rear Gunner. Although, personally, again, not a skill I would get on the first pass, as I would basically dedicate my first point to Situational Awareness. The second row of skills has sort of changed a little bit. Some skills have been adjusted, and there is a new skill that has moved up to tier 2. So first up is Expert Marksman. Expert Marksman has changed. Now, Expert Marksman only offers 2.5 degrees per second buff to guns up to 139 millimeters, which means only destroyers are really going to see a real noticeable change in how fast their turrets traverse. Anything above that, if you happen to be in a battleship with slow turning turrets, you still want to get the skill, just because 0.7 degrees is a touch bit faster, and why not, especially when you're talking about turret traverse speeds in the 60 plus second range. So battleships will benefit from this as well. However, if you're playing with things like the Mogami, which used to get 2.5 degrees per second, 0.7, while still helpful, isn't going to be as noticeable as before. So this is a skill that you can still get, but it's not necessarily now the must-get, most important skill in the second row. And because there is going to be an alternative for Cleveland's and Mogamis that used to use the skill, and I'll get to that in a minute. So ideally, if you're playing a gunboat destroyer, so let's say if you're playing I guess Russian destroyers whose turrets turn a little bit slower, you might want to opt for this. Although US destroyers with their fast turning turrets, you should opt for the new skill at tier 2, which I'll get to in a minute. Japanese destroyers, if you're wanting to use your guns more, you can get this as well. Although again, there is another skill that is also viable, which I'll get to in a minute. If you're playing a destroyer like the Japanese destroyers, or you're playing with the US destroyers and you want to be a little bit more focused on using your torpedoes, you could opt for Torpedo Armament Expertise, which offers a 10% reduction to the reload time of torpedo tubes. Also, if you're playing Japanese carrier and US carriers to some extent, you can still grab the skill for the 20% reduction to servicing time of torpedo bombers. So I guess for this one, Japanese destroyers, maybe Japanese cruisers as well, and carriers, you can opt to get this skill. The third skill is Fire Prevention, which is a 7%, it says minus 7% to the risk of fire. This is a multiplicative reduction, so it's not a real big reduction to the risk of fire. So as a skill, I would say pass on this for pretty much all ships. Then we get to Incoming Fire Alert. Now, earlier I said the Mogami and the Cleveland can offer a different skill, and I would recommend that there's a chance that you can actually use this skill now, which is Incoming Fire Alert. Clevelands and Mogamis can benefit from the skill because if a battleship is shooting at them from long range, they're going to get a little notification and then they can turn away and thus minimize their chances of taking massive citadel hits if they happen to have offered a broadside. So if turret traverse, that little increase isn't really useful to you, I would say you can get Incoming Fire Alert. And of course we move to the last new skill that has moved up to tier 2, which is Last Stand. And this skill is particularly useful because if your engine gets knocked out or your rudder gets knocked out, you can still move your ship. And this particular skill is really useful for US destroyers and Japanese destroyers because it allows you to maintain mobility even after taking a hit. Even Russian destroyers, I would say you can choose between either Expert Marksman or Last Stand depending on your preference. Although, personally for me, I still like having slightly faster turning guns. So my own personal preference would still be Expert Marksman. Although once I got through my first 15 skills, I would save up the next 2 points and get Last Stand. Okay. Moving on to the third row of skills, and this is where there is a brand new skill that is going to change the game quite a bit. And that is the first one here, Torpedo Acceleration. This skill grants your torpedoes 5 knots in speed at a cost of 20% of your range. So only certain destroyers are going to benefit from this. Lower tier destroyers, where your torpedoes don't have that much range, you can actually pass on this skill and get the old Superintendent skill, which gives you 1 additional charge to all of your consumables. So you'll still maintain that extra charge of smoke and extra charge of speed boost. However, once you get up to the slightly higher tier destroyers, for the Japanese, it basically starts at tier 6. Once you get 10k torpedoes, you can opt to get this skill, which will make your torpedoes that much faster. In addition, this skill also applies to carrier torpedo bombers. Your torpedoes, when they drop, will go faster. However, they will also take longer to arm, and therefore you have to drop them further away. If you are using this on carrier torpedo bombers, it has its benefits. The torpedoes go faster. It has its drawbacks. You have to drop a little bit further away. I would say that if you're playing a Japanese carrier, you can get this particular skill because it'll allow your torpedoes to converge a little bit faster. And because it converges a little bit faster, you can land more of your torpedoes. For the US carriers, I would pass on this skill because the US carriers torpedo spread, you want it as close as possible and just land as many torpedoes as possible. You don't want to drop further away and give the enemy ship that you're bombing a chance to turn in and minimize the number of torpedoes that you will hit with. So I would say Japanese CVs, yes. US CVs, no. And of course, if you're in Japanese destroyers or high tier US destroyers with the longer range torpedoes, you can get this skill for sure. High Alert has stayed the same. It offers a 10% reduction to the reload time of the damage control party consumable. So this is a skill that is primarily beneficial to battleships who tend to be on fire a lot and would like to put out fires faster. You could get this skill. However, with the current meta of the game, where destroyers are throwing torpedoes, especially the higher tiers, where destroyers are throwing torpedoes sort of everywhere, you might want to pass on High Alert on the first pass of 15 skill points and instead get Vigilance, because Vigilance increases your acquisition range of torpedoes by 25%, giving you that extra little bit of time to react to torpedoes and hopefully minimize damage. So if you're in a big slow battleship, I would still say Vigilance. Even if you're in a cruiser, I would say get Vigilance, because it allows you to detect those pesky torpedoes just a little bit faster. The fourth skill is Dogfighting Expert, which increases the attack power of fighters while in combat against higher tier aircraft. So you gain a 10% increase to combat performance. So that means if you are in a tier 6 CV and you have stock planes, and you run into another tier 6 CV which has the upgraded planes, it'll make your planes a little bit more competitive. However, personally, I'd say pass on the skill, just because with the mirror matchmaking right now, you're not really going to get a massive disparity in fighter power. So this skill is sort of negligible, and I'm just, as I recommended earlier, just go with torpedo acceleration on Japanese and High Alert on the US. Finally, Superintendent. Superintendent is an interesting skill because it gives +1 additional charge to all consumables. Now, with the way the game is right now, this skill is somewhat interesting, as it's not the universal pick that it used to be. I would say that ships like the gunboat destroyers can still benefit from this, having those extra charges of smoke and speed boost. If you happen to be playing in maybe cruisers and you want to maintain as many charges of the defensive fire AA consumable, then you can opt for something like this as well. Although in the first 15 points, like I mentioned earlier, with the way that the destroyer meta is right now, especially the higher tiers where torpedoes are everywhere, Vigilance I think is going to be more useful. Still, I mean, it is still a viable skill for battleships, destroyers, and cruisers. It's just your own personal preference whether you want the extra charge or whether you want other skills in the tier 3 selections. In the fourth row of skills, we start off with Demolition Expert, which gives a flat 3% increase to the chance of fire caused by shells or bombs. This is primarily going to be useful for gunboat destroyers and cruisers that use a lot of HE. So if you're in a Japanese cruiser, you can offer Demolition Expert, especially if you're in a ZAL. And also if you happen to be in gunboat destroyers like the Russian destroyers, you can benefit from Demolition Expert. US cruisers, especially at the higher tiers like the Des Moines, could benefit from this, although the Baltimore and the Des Moines armor piercing actually isn't so bad these days, so you could actually opt to use armor piercing, and then on certain occasions with the Des Moines, you could opt for HE and Demo Expert. Could be useful. But there's a reason I don't really push this skill for US cruisers. It's because advanced firing training. The US cruisers in patch 5.3 have been buffed, at least the Des Moines has been buffed massively when it comes to AA. And advanced firing training will push out your AA gun range quite a bit further. And if you have an AA range module equipped, it's 7.2 kilometers. That's basically a huge no-fly zone. So, you know, you might want to opt to get advanced firing training if you want to improve your AA on the high-tier German and the high-tier American cruisers. Destroyers, especially like the Gearing or the Khabarovsk and the Udaloy, those ships will still benefit from advanced firing training because the advanced firing training still affects all guns up to 139 millimeters. Although cruisers in the past, like the Cleveland and the Mogami, they will no longer benefit from this skill. Also, if you happen to be running a battleship like the Yamato and you want to run a secondary build, this is a very, very useful skill as well. So overall, it's still a useful skill, just not as universally awesome as it used to be, I guess. The new skill at tier 4, and there's actually 2 of them, but the first new skill is Survivability Expert. And this skill gives plus 400 HP for each tier. So each tier you go up, it's an additional 400 HP, up to a maximum of 4,000 at tier 10. Not super useful on battleships, as they already have a pretty massive HP pool, but is very useful for destroyers, as it can make you that much harder to kill and give you that extra level of survivability. Another thing to note about destroyers equipping the skill is it's actually quite useful in the event that you're in a destroyer and you run up against the new US carrier setups at tier 9 and 10, because those things drop 1,000-pound bombs, which can do quite substantial amounts of damage. So having this skill could make your life that little bit better, because it'll allow you to survive that little bit longer. So I would say that if you were in a destroyer, this is probably a must-get skill. If you're in a cruiser, you could get the skill. If you're in a battleship, you can pass. As for the specific ones about which skill to pick as a destroyer, I would say that if you were in a gunboat and you really need the range, go AFT. If you're in a Japanese destroyer, Survivability Expert, giving you the extra little bit of survival chance. If you're in a destroyer where your preference is don't care being spotted, just like to light more fires, then Demo Expert. I think those would be your choices. As a carrier, Aircraft Servicing Expert is the same as it used to be. 5% survivability buff with a 10% reduction in servicing time. So if you're in a carrier, definitely get this. Manual Fire Control for AA armament. This is actually a very interesting skill. It increases the efficiency of your AA guns, ones larger than 85mm, against a manually designated target, the ones you can do control-click on. It's an interesting skill, I guess, if you were trying to go for a full AA setup. So, I mean, if you were playing... I guess if you're playing a Des Moines, you could opt for this, although personally I still just decided to go for advanced firing training. I mean, it's an interesting one. I guess if you pass on your tier 5 skills, you could get manual fire control just to increase the efficiency of your AA. The last row has some interesting things. Last Chance has been changed. It's now a 30% reduction to the reload time of all armament if your HP is less than 10%. It could be useful in certain conditions, but again, when you think about it, having less than 10% HP is not a lot of HP. If you're in a cruiser, that would be about maybe 4,000 to 5,000 HP remaining. If you're in a battleship, that's maybe under 9,700-ish HP. It's not a lot of HP to work with, so the 30% reduction, I don't think you'll get all that much use out of it, and I think there are better skills at tier 5 to pick, so I would pass on Last Chance. Manual Fire Control for secondary armament, tier 5 skill. On ships from tiers 1 to 6, it's a 15% reduction to dispersion, so your gunners are like 15% less drunk. But not really worth it on tiers 1 to 6 ships. Tiers 7 to 10 ships is a 60% reduction. Now this is where things get interesting, because if you happen to be on a Yamato, if you happen to be on an Izumo or a Nagato where you have great secondary guns and you've opted for a secondary build, then the manual fire control for secondary armament is awesome. As you will see, your shots are a lot more tightly grouped and they have a greater chance of actually hitting something. So your gunners are definitely not drunk when you have this skill and you've designated the target. So definitely something to think about if you're running a secondary build on your ships. Preventative maintenance has also changed. It's now a 50% reduction to the risk of incapacitation of modules. But again, it's one of those skills where it's not a bad skill per se, but they're more useful skills. So on a destroyer, let's say I don't really want to lose my guns, then okay, I can get the skill to prevent my guns from being lost. But if I don't have Concealment Expert, I'm still likely to be spotted earlier and get shot at earlier and still have a chance of losing my guns. So you know, it's one of those things that, like, the skill's not bad, but there's something that's better. And moving on to Concealment Expert, this is a skill that is really, really useful for a lot of ships. If you happen to be in destroyers, this is pretty much a must-get skill at tier 5. If you happen to be in a cruiser, even US cruisers or Japanese cruisers, you might want to opt for the skill just to make yourself more stealthy and less of a target for other ships. Battleships, only certain battleships I think would benefit from this skill. So the Montana, which tends to be shot at a lot, could benefit from this skill, although the Yamato not as much, especially because the Yamato has alternative builds that can actually work quite well, like the secondary build. Still, I mean, if you like being stealthier with your Yamato, you can still get the skill as well. Carriers, I would say you would pass on the skill just because there's something much more important to get, which of course is air supremacy. One extra fighter, one extra dive bomber. If you're in a carrier, you have to get the skill. It's going to make your fighters a little bit more competitive, and it's going to make your dive bombers hit harder. So kind of a self-explanatory thing. And finally, you have Jack of all trades, which says the 15% reduction to reload time of all mounted consumables. Again, usable on certain ships depending on the situation. Some ships would benefit, I think, a little bit more from this. Maybe, my guess would be potentially if you were in a battleship that gets set on fire a lot, maybe you want to offer this instead of secondary. So I don't know, if you happen to be in a Montana, you're always on fire, you might want to offer this just to reduce the time that you're on fire. Still, I think that there are other skills at tier 5 which are a little bit better. Okay, so on a US cruiser, how I've set it up is situational awareness, expert marksman, vigilance, advanced firing training, concealment expert for the first 15 points. With the remaining 3 points that you have, because we're usually talking about 18-point captains and not 19-point captains, for the remaining skill points, I would say you could opt for something like superintendent for 3 points. You can also opt for potentially incoming fire alert for 2 points, with 1 point dedicated to basic firing training. For Japanese cruisers, here's where things get a little bit interesting. I think Japanese cruisers, there's something interesting there. Still situational awareness on the first skill. On the second one, now here's something that you can think about. You can get either expert marksman if you want to deal with, your guns and play with your guns more and have your guns turn a bit faster. You could offer torpedo armament expertise. Japanese cruisers do have decent torpedoes, so it is something you can consider. So there's like a one choice or another. Personally, I'm still going to be using guns more, so I'm going to go for expert marksman. Third row of skills, also a bunch of choices here. You could go with the standard cruiser choices of vigilance, just to be more aware of potential incoming torpedoes. You could go for superintendent, just getting those extra AA barrage charges. Hell, I mean, in some circumstances, I could see torpedo acceleration being somewhat viable as well for certain Japanese cruisers. So the third tier skill, I think, can be interesting. Again, with the current meta of the game and trying to provide maybe early warning for your own team, I would still get vigilance right now. Fourth row of skills, if you're in a Japanese cruiser like a Zal, demo expert all the way, and it's pretty much the best skill. Just set stuff on fire all the time. Although survivability expert is viable as well, just to make your ship a little bit harder to kill. On the fifth row of skills, on a Japanese cruiser, concealment expert all the way, you want to be as stealthy as possible, as that'll prevent you from getting shot to death from long range. So again, that's the first 15 skills. The remaining 3 points, again, there's a couple of choices here. Again, like I mentioned earlier, you can either get superintendent, torpedo acceleration with those remaining 3 skill points. You could also opt for potentially, you could offer things like torpedo armament expertise, maybe with basics of survivability, maybe with basic firing training. Those are really sort of your choice. You could opt for incoming fire alert. Those are all really your own personal preferences. So that sets up the Japanese cruisers here. Alright, and finally, German cruisers. German cruisers are really interesting just because there is so many different ways right now I think that a German cruiser can be set up. And I don't think I can cover all of them, so you do have to go out there and test and play with them a little bit. First skill, I would still get situational awareness. On the second row of skills for the German cruisers, there's 2 choices really. I mean, you could opt for expert marksman to have your guns turn faster, useful for ships like the York, useful for the higher tier German cruisers. Lower tier German cruisers, I think you could benefit from Last Stand, just because the engine of the rudder does tend to get knocked out quite frequently. So that is a viable option for skill. Later on, once you get past that, with the third row of skills, I would still say get vigilance now. However, superintendent is viable as well. Same with torpedo acceleration, also somewhat viable, and high alert is somewhat viable. So your choice, but again, with the current meta, go vigilance. On the fourth row of skills, here's where things can be kind of interesting. you can make your ship a little bit more durable, get Survivability Expert. You can go with an A setup. The high-tier German cruisers have pretty damn lethal AA. So you could go Advanced Firing Training, and then you could also go with something like Manual Fire Control for AA. So sacrificing a 5th tier skill for a 4th tier and additional 1st tier skill. And in which case the 1st tier skill I would get Basic Firing Training. So you could go with a full AA setup. You could also go with a secondary setup, so then, go Advanced Firing Training and then go to Manual Fire Control for secondary armament. You could do that as well. You could also go with the very, very traditional one, which is Situational Awareness, go with Expert Marksman, go with Vigilance, go with Advanced Firing Training or Survivability Expert, and then go with Concealment Expert, which is much more standard. So the German cruisers, namely because they can fit so many roles, they can be a decent AA platform. They do have torpedoes that can be used. They can also gun really, really well. So with the German skill tree, you really got to kind of play around with it and experiment with it in order to find the thing that suits your playstyle the most. If you happen to be in a destroyer, let's say, for example, the Shimakaze, this is how a Shima's captain skills should be set up. There you go, there's my Shima. So if I was a Shima, I would go Situational Awareness, I would go Torpedo Armament Expertise, I would go with Torpedo Acceleration, just to give the torpedoes that much more speed at a small cost in range, which is really not a big deal. Then I would opt for Survivability Expert, and then I would go for Concealment Expert to round out the 15 points on a Shimakaze. And that's pretty much for, most Japanese destroyers starting at tier 6 and above, although if you're below tier 6, you might want to still opt for Superintendent. With the remaining 3 points that I'll have, I would say get Last Stand, and potentially get maybe Basic Firing Training. That could be one to get, but personally I would say Last Stand is worthwhile to get on a Japanese destroyer. If you're on a Russian destroyer, Russian destroyers are actually quite interesting because they are a gunboat, and as a gunboat I would say Situational Awareness still. I personally would opt for Expert Marksman to start, just because you want to have your guns always be able to track regardless of the situation how aggressively you're turning. I would offer that, and then I would say Superintendent because you want to have the extra speed boost and smoke charges. And then I would personally still go with AFT just because I do like that extra little bit of range. That's just my personal preference. I would still go with AFT, and Concealment Expert is still going to be what I would opt for. With the remaining 3 extra points, I would say Basic Firing Training and Last Stand would be your ideal choices. For carriers are very straightforward. For the US carriers, I would go Situational Awareness, I would go Torpedo Armament Servicing, I would opt for High Alert, I would opt for Aircraft Servicing Expert, and I would opt for Air Supremacy as the first 15 skill points. With the remaining skill points, you have some choices here. You can either go with something like, I guess you could go with Vigilance if you really feel like it. You could also get Torpedo Acceleration if you want to have your torpedoes just be a little bit faster. It is viable. Personally, I would have just gone with Basic Firing Training and Basics of Survivability. Although if you are afraid of long-range incoming fire, you could always get Incoming Fire Alert, although as a carrier, even if that alert comes up, it's not likely you're going to turn away all that quickly. So it's really up to you there. Japanese carriers, it'll be the same setup, except on the 3rd row I would opt for Torpedo Acceleration. So on a Yamato, if you're building for secondaries, you could go Situational Awareness first, then go Expert Marksman, as Yamato turrets do turn incredibly slowly, and then Vigilance, and then go with Advanced Firing Training, and then go with Manual Fire Control for the first 15 points. And then with the remaining 3 points, you can either opt for High Alert if you don't like being on fire as much, or you could always opt for Basic Firing Training, and then maybe Fire Prevention. Just that little bit reduction in fire would not be too bad. You could also opt for, you could opt for, I don't know, an extra heal charge, so you could always get Superintendent with those 3 extra points. So again, very much up to you and your own personal preferences. On the US battleships, I would say go with Situational Awareness again. On the first one, I would still opt for Expert Marksman. You want to be able to have your battleship turrets track. Vigilance is something that you can't break away from anymore. Now, there are some interesting choices here for the US battleship, and I do have to mention something specifically for US battleships here, which is that you could have advanced firing training, so you could increase your AA, increase the range of your secondaries. You could opt for Survivability Expert. 4,000 HP isn't really all that much, so, but it does also improve your heal a little bit. You get a little bit more HP healed per second. So how do you determine which of these two skills you would like to pick? And I would say if you are playing in divisions a lot, go for the extra little bit of survivability. If you're soloing a lot, advanced firing training just to make you a more difficult target for aircraft to attack. So that's how I think I would pick my tier 4 skills. In this particular case, let's say I'm picking more for solo, I will take advanced firing training, and then on my tier 5 skills. For Montana, I still like Concealment Expert just because I like to stay away from stuff. It's, I like to stay hidden. The Montana is one of those ships that gets shot at a lot. Yamatos especially love to shoot at you, so if you can blink out, it's a good thing. And with the remaining 3 points that you get, you can again opt for an extra heal charge with Superintendent. You could also opt for basic firing training to boost up your AA. And maybe if you're worried about Yamato long range fire, incoming fire alert, those are all kind of options that you can choose. Fire prevention, again, another choice. Also high alert, another choice. So these are all things you can choose if you're in a US battleship. And folks, that pretty much covers the new skills as well as all the ship classes in the game and the recommended skill setups. If you have any additional questions, please do leave them in the comment section below, and I will try my best to get back to you, all of you. So aside from all that, take care, have a good one, and I'll talk to all of you again soon.